Every sign your life is unfolding exactly as it should begins with a feeling that looks, from the outside, like failure. You look at the people around you who seem to figure everything out early. They step seamlessly into the right career, the right marriage, the right timeline, building a life that made perfect sense by the time they were 30. You have spent decades watching them, carrying a creeping secret anxiety that you are irreparably behind. You feel like you are digging a hole while everyone else is building a house. But Carl Jung understood a clinical reality about the human psyche that the modern world completely ignores. A wooden shed can be built in a single weekend, but a cathedral requires years of subterranean foundation work before a single wall is ever visible above ground. By the end of this video, you will have a precise psychological checklist to determine what kind of structure you are building. You will understand that your delayed timeline is not a symptom of failure. It is the specific structural requirement of a psyche that is unfolding exactly as it should. But this process is not comforting, because the signs that your life is on the right track usually disguise themselves as the exact moments everything falls apart. The life that arrived exactly on time is almost always the smaller life. You look at the goals you used to chase with ruthless efficiency, and suddenly you have zero motivation for them. You cannot force yourself to care about the networking, the hustle, the social positioning that once felt like oxygen. You sit in the same career, the same room, the same routines, and the engine that used to pull you forward through discipline and fear has simply stopped firing. People around you are still performing their ambition with apparent ease, posting their promotions, celebrating their acquisitions, moving with a momentum that feels like it belongs to a different species than the paralysis currently settling into your bones. Everything feels heavy in a way that has nothing to do with how much you slept. You think you are burned out. You think you have lost your edge. The quieter, more terrifying thought, the one you do not say aloud, is that perhaps you simply do not have what it takes. That the stagnation is not a phase, but a permanent condition. The engine is not broken down. It has refused to burn fuel for a destination your psyche no longer recognizes as real. Jung observed that the self, the deep organizing center of the total psyche, far larger than the conscious ego, sometimes deliberately withdraws energy from the outer world. To the conscious ego, this withdrawal is a catastrophe. The ambitions go flat. The goals that once burned with urgency become faintly absurd. The ego scrambles to reignite what it has lost, signing up for courses, setting new targets, constructing new 5-year plans, not understanding that the fire was not extinguished by accident. It was pulled back by something deeper and older than the ego's need to produce. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus, whom Jung studied obsessively, named the law that governs this process, enantiodromia. When any psychological state is pushed to its absolute extreme, it must begin to reverse into its contrary. The pendulum does not hang motionless at the end of its arc because it is dead. It hangs motionless because the entire force that drove it there is about to drive it back in the opposite direction. The stillness at the extreme is the maximum concentration of power the system has ever contained, gathered into a single point, compressed and waiting. Your paralysis is not a personality flaw or a chemical imbalance. It is the specific sensation of a psyche that has reached the outer limit of a phase that was never meant to be permanent. Converting everything it gathered outward into the raw material of an inward construction you cannot yet see. The nigredo, the alchemical blackening that Jung used to map this very stage, looks like death from the outside. To the alchemist, it is the most essential stage of the entire process, because without the blackening, there can be no whitening and no final gold. You have not lost your drive. Your engine has simply refused to burn fuel for a life that is too small for you anymore. But the way the psyche enforces this stagnation is what makes the process feel so terrifying. Because when the self decides it is time to build something larger, it begins by systematically dismantling everything you thought was protecting you. You replay the moments your life went off track, The relationship that crumbled just as it was settling into something real. The career opportunity that slipped through your fingers for no logical reason. The decade where everything you touched seemed to dissolve at the threshold of arrival, as though an invisible hand kept pulling the chair away the moment you finally tried to sit down. You have carried the grief of these losses for years, assuming they were proof that something is fundamentally wrong with your luck, your constitution, or the basic fairness of a universe that gave other people what it withheld from you. Look at them again, not through the lens of what you wanted, through the lens of who you were when you wanted it. Jung observed that what we suppress in order to survive the first half of life does not disappear. It accumulates in the shadow, and the shadow is primarily a reservoir of unspent power, creativity, and intensity that the persona, the face you built for the world, could never afford to express. He named this the gold in the shadow. He also delivered a warning so precise it reads like a diagnosis written for the person watching this right now. He wrote in Civilization in Transition that in the neurosis is hidden one's worst enemy and best friend. It is his own self, the other whom he was always seeking to exclude from his life. The neurosis, the friction, the relentless sense that something is not right. Jung is saying that inside the very thing you have been trying to fix, to overcome, to outrun, lives the part of you that you have spent your entire adult life refusing to meet, not because it is dangerous, because it is inconveniently large, because the people who needed you manageable and predictable could not have survived contact with the full force of who you actually are. Now apply this to the specific losses that have defined your timeline, the relationship that fell apart just as it was solidifying. If you had stayed, if that door had held, you would have carried your unintegrated shadow into the center of that structure. And the shadow always arrives eventually. When it arrives inside a structure of success, it does not knock politely. Inside a marriage or a career that was built on the persona rather than the full self, it does not knock politely. It detonates. People who achieve massive external success before their shadow is integrated almost always experience a devastating collapse at midlife, because the shadow dismantles the success from the inside. The very things they built become the wreckage. The doors that closed in your face were not bad luck. They were the self-moving furniture, removing you from rooms you did not belong in, clearing the space for something that will actually fit the full architecture of who you are, not the edited, performable version that the world was willing to reward. The grief of this realization is real. You watched people receive what you wanted. You watched them build lives on timelines you were denied. You mourned in silence for years, assuming the verdict was final. But you are beginning to see with a clarity that has nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with architectural observation, that if you had received what you wanted back then, your unintegrated shadow would have burned it to the ground. The protection felt like punishment. That does not make the punishment less painful. It makes it precise, and something else is surfacing alongside this recognition. The drives you suppressed because they were too much. The creative intensity you locked away to fit into structures that had no room for it. The quiet sense of authority that has been gathering in you for years without any outward confirmation. The anger that lives beneath the patience, accumulated across decades of absorbing and accommodating and making yourself smaller so that the room could be more comfortable for everyone else. These are not signs of damage. They are signs that the shadow is delivering its gold. And the fact that you are sitting with them now, that you are letting them exist without immediately converting them into something palatable, means the integration has already begun. If you have spent years mourning a door that closed and are only now beginning to see that the room behind it would have destroyed you, write this in the comments. The door was locked from the inside. And the moment you stop mourning the false structure, you confront the greatest psychological myth of the modern world. You are 45, or 54, or 61, and the culture tells you, with the combined authority of a billion screens, that your window has closed. The implicit message behind every celebration of youth and speed, every algorithmic amplification of the prodigy and the early achiever, is that the significant work of a human life happens in its first act. If yours did not arrive by 30 or 40, the story is essentially over and you miss the casting call. Jung rejected this mythology with the precision of a surgeon and the contempt of someone who had watched it destroy his patients. He wrote in The Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche that we cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning. For what was great in the morning will be little at evening, and what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie. That is a structural description of how the human psyche is built, delivered with the finality of a natural law. The morning of life is governed by the ego. Its task is expansion, building the persona, establishing position, proving to the social collective that you exist and that you can produce. This phase runs on the fuel of should, what parents wanted, what society rewarded, what the fear of being left behind demanded. The afternoon of life is governed by the self. Its task is individuation, the stripping away of the persona to become what you actually are rather than what was required. And this phase cannot run on the old fuel. The old fuel runs out. You have felt it. The exhaustion that no amount of rest repairs. The flatness that no new goal can lift. The quiet horror of realizing that the rewards you spent decades chasing no longer produce any feeling at all. That is the engine switching from ambition to meaning, and the transition between those two fuels feels like stagnation because the culture has no name for what is actually happening to you. The century plant, Agave americana, spends up to 30 years in a low, unremarkable state while spring weeds bloom and die around it every season. For 3 decades it appears to be failing. Then it sends up a flowering stalk that can reach 30 feet, an event the spring weeds could never have produced, because the spring weeds were never accumulating the kind of energy required. The timing is not the same because the scale is not the same. The early bloomers were never building what you are building. They were playing a different game entirely, with different stakes, on a field that will not survive the afternoon, and something else that needs to be named. For those of you who are 55 or 60 or older, you are experiencing the grief of a persona that served you for decades beginning to lose its function. The professional identity, the role in the family, the competence everyone relied on, the version of you that was known and recognized and loved for 30 or 40 years is beginning to feel hollow. And the hollowness is not something you can fix by trying harder. Every relationship built on the persona is now in a quiet state of renegotiation. Not because those relationships were wrong, because the version of you those connections were made with is no longer fully present. You are mourning an entire way of being recognized, an entire way of being loved. And that grief is not a sign of failure, it is a sign of genuine transformation. Part of what makes it so disorienting is the sudden clarity of wondering how you wore the mask for 30 years and never once felt the edges. You cannot mourn something that was never real. If you are 50 and feel like you are just beginning, Jung would say you are correct. You have finished the preface. The first chapter is only now being written. And the favor the psyche did you, the agonizing, merciless favor, was refusing to let you peek in the preface. The early peek is a psychological trap. Those who win the game of the morning arrive in the afternoon with no psychological tools, forced to defend a hollow victory against a shadow that has been growing in the dark for decades. They built their house in the morning, and now they are watching it settle, crack, and shift on a foundation that was never meant to hold what the afternoon demands. Your delay guarantees you are playing the correct game at the correct time. The timeline you have been comparing yourself to was designed for people who will never individuate. It was never your timeline, it was theirs. If you are recognizing yourself in this pattern, if the mythology of the early peak has been the quiet torment underneath your every comparison, the alchemist's path was written for exactly this moment. It gives you Jung-based boundary drills, perception training, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn that recognition into a practice you can use. 236 pages. Downloadable now at thesurrealmind.com. But the psyche does not leave you to navigate this afternoon entirely blindly. It provides undeniable evidence that you are where you need to be. You look back at the cascade of events that brought you to this exact moment, and something uncanny begins to emerge from the pattern. Not a narrative you are imposing, something that was already there, waiting for you to develop the eyes to see it. The seemingly random disaster in your past, the one you carried for years as proof of a hostile universe, now reveals itself as the only possible event that could have corrected your trajectory. The conversation that arrived on the very day you were going to give up. The encounter years ago that altered the direction of your life in a way no conscious plan could have produced. The book that fell off a shelf and opened to a sentence that described your situation with impossible accuracy. You dismissed each of these as coincidence when they happened. You are no longer sure they were. Jung spent years collaborating with the physicist Wolfgang Pauli on a principle that the modern world still refuses to take seriously. He called it synchronicity, the acausal connecting principle, not coincidence in the trivial sense. An observation that the inner world of the psyche and the outer world of physical reality are 2 aspects of a single underlying order he called the unus mundus, the one world. When a profound internal shift occurs, the external world is structurally required to respond. The famous clinical moment. A patient sits in Jung's consulting room, recounting a dream of a golden scarab. She has been resistant to the work, defended by a rationalism so complete that nothing has been able to break through. At that exact moment, a live scarab beetle begins tapping at the window of the consulting room. Jung catches it and hands it to her. The coincidence shatters her rational defenses in a way no argument could have managed and allows the healing to begin. The inner world spoke, and the outer world answered. Now apply this to your own history, not the way motivational content applies it, telling you the universe is conspiring to hand you your desires. That is the ego's fantasy of synchronicity, and it misses the point entirely. It reduces the deepest navigational intelligence of the psyche to a cosmic wish fulfillment service. The real mechanism is colder, more clinical, and far more intelligent. Synchronicity is the self correcting the ego's course. The job that fell through was the self withholding what would have cost you the real destination. The relationship that ended at what felt like the worst possible moment ended at the only moment that would have allowed the internal work to begin. The video that appeared in your feed today, on this particular day, at this particular threshold in your life. These are not accidents. They are the scarab tapping at the window. The seemingly random delays and derailments in your history are structural evidence of the self operating as an intelligent navigational system, orchestrating the conditions required for your individuation. You do not have to believe this as a matter of faith. You only have to look back at the architecture of your own history with the clarity you now possess and determine for yourself whether the pattern is genuinely random or whether it carries the unmistakable signature of design. Whether the disasters that felt like cruelty were actually interventions of such surgical accuracy that no conscious mind could have planned them. Whether the life that did not arrive on time was being held back by something that understood, long before you did, what arriving too early would have cost you. This evidence brings you to the final sign and the realization of what you have actually been waiting for. Jung asked a question that strips away every remaining illusion. He wrote, in The Development of Personality, what is it in the end that induces a man to go his own way and to rise out of unconscious identity with the mass as out of a swathing mist? It is what is commonly called vocation, an irrational factor that destines a man to emancipate himself from the herd and from its well-trodden paths. Vocation, not a career or a job title or an ambition or the thing you do to pay rent or to prove to the people who doubted you that they were wrong. The thing life is calling you to become. A quality of presence so specific and so heavy that it cannot be faked, cannot be rushed, and cannot be bestowed upon someone who has not done the full work of earning it. The reason the life you wanted has not arrived yet is not that you were unworthy of it. It is that the version of you who existed 5 or 10 years ago would have been crushed by the weight of it. You would have used it to prove your worth to people whose opinions you have since outgrown. You would have poured it into the persona, into the performance, into the machinery of external validation that your psyche has spent the last decade dismantling piece by piece. The success would have arrived, and you would have bent it into a prison. Because the shadow was not yet integrated, the persona was not yet cracked open, and the vocation was not yet distinguishable from the ambition that preceded it. You cannot carry what you have not yet earned, and earning it has nothing to do with suffering enough, or waiting long enough, or reading enough Jungian psychology at 3 in the morning while the rest of the house sleeps. Earning it means becoming heavy enough, dense enough with integrated shadow, with shed persona, with the accumulated gravity of decades spent building something beneath the surface that no one could see, psychologically substantial enough that the weight of what is coming does not crush you or corrupt you or send you running back to the small life that once felt safe. The people who received their vocation early and were destroyed by it were not weaker than you. They were lighter. They had not yet earned the mass to hold what landed on them. The silence you are standing in right now, the one that feels like the absence of progress, is the final curing of the concrete. The foundation has been poured. The alchemical blackening has done its work. The shadow has delivered its gold. The persona has cracked open, and the self beneath it is standing, for the first time, in its own weight. What remains is the steady, heavy, irreversible authority of someone who has descended into psychological depths that most people spend their entire lives avoiding and has returned carrying something the surface dwellers will never possess. You were never behind. That word belongs to a vocabulary you have outgrown. The map you were using to measure your position was drawn for a different territory entirely, by people who have never visited the one you are standing in now. The shed builders finished decades ago. Their structures are already weathering, already settling into the ground, already requiring the kind of emergency repairs that consume the energy they once used for living. Yours has not yet risen above the ground, and every year of invisible foundation work is the reason it will hold when theirs do not. Your life is unfolding with the precision of a structure that was always meant to take this long. And the heavy, unshakable authority you feel gathering inside you, the one you cannot explain to anyone who has not walked this particular corridor of the psyche, is the final sign, not a promise, not a consolation, a structural fact, as verifiable as the concrete beneath a building that has not yet broken the surface. The cathedral is being built. It has always been being built, and you have at last earned the weight to enter it. Jung-based boundary drills, perception training for empaths, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. 236 pages, downloadable now at thesurrealmind.com.